Good evening. Welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. And on the show this evening, President Trump's interest in Greenland has intensified significantly since his return to office in 2025. And following the recent US military operation in Venezuela, the administration has pivoted from viewing Greenland as a real estate deal to being a non-negotiable national security priority. Now, some say that there's a three-phase plan. It's been reported by various media outlets. It suggests a calculated strategy to bring the territory under US jurisdiction. It's almost unbelievable that we should be reporting all of this, but that is something that needs to be looked at seriously now. So if there is a three-phase plan, how exactly would it work? Let's break it down for you. The US has ramped up diplomatic presence and has offered massive investments in Greenland's infrastructure and mining sectors. The goal is to replace Danish subsidies with American financial support. The US administration is publicly questioning Denmark's ability to defend the Arctic. Donald Trump recently stated that Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships. Therefore, he wants a greater American presence. Now, recent reports suggest that the Trump administration has identified and is courting pro-independence Greenlandic figures. The strategy involves supporting a secession movement from Denmark. Now, will that actually take place? What are the contours? But before we get to that, why is Greenland a strategic prize? Well, it sits at the heart of the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, a critical maritime choke point. Controlling it allows the US to monitor Russian and Chinese submarines entering the Atlantic. But America already does so. Therefore, is additional access to Greenland what this is all really about. America also has a primary site at the Pitufik space base, which houses early warning radars vital for detecting incoming ballistic missiles. Again, it already has it. Why does Trump want Greenland? Greenland contains vast untapped deposits of rare earth elements. The US wants to secure these to break their dependence on Chinese supply chains for example, batteries and advanced weaponry, or EVs as well. We're talking about rare earths which are used for chips. Well, joining us now, Shashank Joshi, the defense editor of The Economist. Great speaking to you and Happy New Year, Shashank.
Hi, Vishnu. Hello. Happy New Year to you as well.
First up, with Secretary Rubio reportedly preferring to buy Greenland, right? I mean, that's one theory. Reportedly, I use the word. Why is the administration simultaneously floating military options, in your opinion?
Well, I think there's two things here going on, Vishnu. First of all, America is sort of, you could say, drunk on power after its incredibly successful military raid in Caracas. And it's been threatening Cuba, Colombia, Mexico. But the thing you have to bear in mind is, for the United States, this isn't just about Latin America. This is about the Western Hemisphere. That is why the president himself has raised the Monroe Doctrine. And I think we can easily forget the Monroe Doctrine isn't just about the countries to the south of the United States. It's also about the countries to the north. And that includes Canada and it includes Greenland, which of course was occupied by the United States in the Second World War. So there is a kind of post-Venezuelan sense of hubris, you could say, in which America is asserting itself. Indeed, as we're speaking, Vishnu, I've just seen America seize 2 sanctioned oil tankers, one of them near Iceland, another one of them in Latin American waters. But I think the other reason for this is, as Rubio suggested to lawmakers, the military threats are also a way of putting pressure on Denmark. And the American government believes that the more it dangles the prospect of military threats, however much this may horrify Europeans, indeed it horrifies many Republicans in Congress as well, it believes it will encourage the pressure on Denmark to make concessions to the US along the lines of the concessions that you just described a moment earlier.
Now, we were both at the Munich Security Conference a year back. The rug at that stage seemed to be pulled from under Europe's feet when it came to collective defense, the premise of NATO. Do you believe that any American expansionism into Greenland, whether it's overt or less overt, even if it's not military, could sort of signify the beginning of the end of NATO?
Well, we've heard Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, say explicitly this week that any attack on Greenland would be the end of NATO as we know it. And I think that's right. You know, look, I don't need to tell you, Vishnu, but you know the top military officer in NATO is the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SACEUR. That job for 80 years has always been held by a four-star American general. America is the linchpin of NATO. If America is gobbling up parts of NATO soil covered by Article 5, the alliance's collective defense clause, then what hope is there that it would defend Europe against Russian aggression in the east? I think there wouldn't be any left at that stage. And while we have had tension between NATO allies in the past, for example, between Turkey and Greece over Cyprus in the 1970s, I think this would be qualitatively different. I think this really would be the end of NATO as a meaningful political alliance, and we would see a sudden surge of defense spending in Europe as countries responded to what would be an unprecedented and quite remarkable situation.
How would Russia be seeing these developments?
I think with absolute glee. Now, look, on the face of it, there is the paradox here, right? Which is that America says the reason it wants Greenland is because, as President Trump said, there are Russian and Chinese ships all over Greenland. There's Russian activity. On the other hand, we know from Trump's diplomacy with Russia, with Kirill Dmitriev, the Russian envoy for Ukraine, that one of his aims is to do business deals with Russia, including joint drilling projects in the Arctic. How do we square these things? Well, in Trump world, we can't. They're completely contradictory. But I think the Russians will be absolutely delighted to see this transatlantic rift, NATO arguing amongst itself at a time when, obviously the alliance is also trying to negotiate with the Russians over the future of Ukraine. This doesn't mean, of course, Vladimir Putin gets everything he wants. I think we are still, I've just come off a week in which I have seen Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner visit Paris, arrange a deal with the Europeans. So the Russians are also looking a little bit nervously at how the Americans are unpredictable, very mercurial, very capricious in their diplomacy. But in terms of the discord within the transatlantic alliance, I think they will be extremely satisfied with that.
So, therefore, the big question, it's sort of going back to the Denmark situation, and I guess that's the reason we are discussing this. Why did Trump tease revisiting Greenland in 20 days? I mean, he's given a time period over here. What specific actions might sort of happen by the end of this month?
Well, I would always caution against assuming too much strategic planning and caution in what Trump says. I remember, of course, last year he gave Russia a specific, very, very clear deadline for agreeing to a ceasefire in Ukraine. And of course, Russia quite savvily ignored that deadline, continued to negotiate, and nothing more was heard of that. So, I would read this more as Trump attempting to capitalize on the sense of momentum around American power in the Western Hemisphere, following his snatching of Nicolas Maduro, following the blockade of Venezuela, trying to translate that into diplomatic gains rather than as any kind of specific thought out plan. And what I will say is that Greenland is very, very different to Venezuela. It's different to Cuba. It's different to Colombia in that, you have a generation of US military officers, of senior generals who have worked extremely closely with NATO. They will remember the fact, for instance, that Denmark suffered per capita casualties that were as high as anyone else in Afghanistan, in the Afghan war. So they will be horrified by this. This is not going to be a point of consensus inside the administration. And when I asked a senior European official, how worried are you about Greenland? This looks very serious. They said to me, yes, we are very concerned, but he will look at Cuba and he will look at Iran first. So I think there is a sense that there is there are other priorities above Greenland in the president's ever-changing mix of priorities and fixations.
Is European resolve at this stage, whatever we've read about it in their public statements, at all of significance when it comes to Donald Trump?
I think it is. Look at my country, Vishnu, the UK. We have great dependencies on the United States. Our nuclear program depends on cooperation with the US. Our intelligence apparatus is interwoven with that of the US in the Five Eyes alliance. We do not publicly criticize the United States very easily. It takes quite something to get us to do that for completely understandable reasons. And what we have seen this week is even the UK has signed on to a joint statement with the French, with the Germans, with others, effectively rebuking the United States, saying very, very clearly, this is a matter for the Danes and for those in Greenland, not for the United States. Of course, that doesn't mean we would necessarily take things much further than that. But if this continues, I think you will have a very difficult discussion in Europe, which will say, look, we recognize we can't stop an American invasion by force. Everyone understands that. But what we could do is deeply complicate American calculations. If, for example, you had many more European officials or military forces sitting in Greenland seats of government, in facilities, in critical infrastructure, that would say if America wants to come in, it would have to take some very messy and difficult steps against Europeans to do that. And I think you will be having those conversations take place with the Danes in private in the weeks ahead.
All right, Shashank, great speaking to you. Thanks very much for joining us. It's almost unbelievable. Beginning of the year, we're talking about whether Greenland might be conquered. We leave it over there. Thanks very much. I'm joined now by Mikkel Drunge Olsen, senior researcher and foreign policy expert at the Danish Institute of International Studies, and James Marlowe, a foreign and defense analyst in the United Kingdom. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for being with us. Mr. Olsen, let me come to you first. Is there a sense of complete disbelief in Denmark that this is actually happening, that we're actually discussing this? Do people believe that this is some sort of a bluff, or are you viewing this as being a very real possibility, particularly since Trump has given a 20-day deadline?
Well, I think in the beginning, about a year ago, that feeling may have been prevalent in some circles, but I think now that it has been going on for more than a year, I think there's this growing realization that this is not going to go away. This is something that we will likely keep talking about for the remainder of Trump's presidency, unless, of course, he forces the issue and invades, as you talked about, right? So yes, there is a sense that this is happening, and there is a deep worry. I think that the prevailing opinion in policy circles still is that it's unlikely that we're going to see a military invasion. I think the analysis is that the political costs of such an invasion will be too high. It could end NATO, but also because an invasion of Greenland is deeply unpopular as a policy choice in the US. I think last I checked, 7% of the polled Americans supported a military invasion of Greenland. So there's a massive majority against it domestically in the US. And I think that may actually be one of the most important reasons why I think it won't happen.
James Marlowe, even if it doesn't happen, and given what we've seen in Munich last year, the security conference, and the fact that America has one way or the other redefined their military association with Europe, do you believe that NATO is now in a far more precarious position than it's ever been? And, as a viable security entity, we could be seeing the beginning of the end of the way it's existed for decades.
Well, firstly, I will put money on the fact that the Americans are not going to invade a military invasion into Greenland. I'm pretty certain about that.
Well, why do you say so?
Why do I say so? I think the reason is we're hearing all of this, and I think a lot of the rhetoric is actually coming from pundits and journalists and all sorts of experts, and even some of the politicians who are making some noise at this point. And I think that's what's putting the smile on Putin's face at this time. But I can see that President Trump is somebody who I think really wants world peace, and he wants to just be everyone to live happily ever after. We're living in a very volatile world at this point. It seems to be getting worse every single day. It's triggered by the fact that China is building up militarily. It believes it's going to be the #1 military nation in the world by 2027. That's just a year or so away. The Russians clearly have got their eyes set on Ukraine and don't seem to want to stop on this, no matter what the politicians say. And this is a big concern for President Trump because he's being told by his military leaders, look, we have to do something about this. We can't allow the Europeans to run things themselves, because in some cases he doesn't agree with Europeans. He's actually more of a centre-right person, and a lot of the European leaders, not all of them, but some of the European leaders come from a political left point of view, and he feels that that's not the way to deal with people like Putin and others. Although, having said that, of course, they have been very strong in their rhetoric against Putin, but they're not going to survive militarily without somebody like the Americans and President Trump. Now, to answer your question on NATO, yes, of course, things have very much changed with NATO, and that happened as soon as obviously the Russians, who made it very, very clear that he believed that Russia the biggest disaster for Russia was the fall of the Soviet Union, and Putin wanted to build up the Russian Federation once again. So this was always on the cards. The problem is that President Trump was the only one who actually pointed out that the Europeans want to be part of the club, they want to be a member of it, but they don't want to actually pay for the membership. And since that time, he made those noises from his first term in 2016. Of course, you've seen Europeans cough up in terms of money.
No, so I understand this, but Mr. Marlow, if I can just come in for half a second, essentially what you are saying is that Europe won't have a choice one way or the other. Europe requires an American presence. Europe trades heavily. The defense industry, the defense aspect of it, high-tech sharing is a key part of it. And therefore, if America were to make moves, not necessarily militarily, right, but in other ways in Greenland, Europe would just have to accept, right?
You know, I would like to hear, and I've never been to Greenland before, I would like the opportunity to visit Greenland, but I hear from some of the Americans who have visited Greenland, and I'm not specifically talking about the vice president, but I hear that some people in Greenland actually want investment. They are very, very concerned that the Danish, all being a great country, and a member of the EU, a member of NATO, but the Danish are a small country. They're not able to invest in the way that other countries like the United States would be.
You don't see that as being a red herring?
Well, not really, because if it's not the Americans, and if the Americans sit back, if it was any other leadership, and they sit back and they just watch things from the other side of the Atlantic, you may see the Chinese move in on Greenland. And it could be that the people
How would they do that? Militarily? Perhaps not yet. But hold on, let me just...
Not necessarily militarily, it could be economically, because economically they're buying up everything in Europe, well, not everything, but many places, many ports. They're making sure that they are going to be in control, not just military.
It's still run by Denmark, so, I mean, an excess Chinese presence over there seems unlikely right now, but Mikkel Runge-Olesen, you've heard what Mr. Marlow had to say. Would you like to respond?
Yes, I would. I think when it comes to Greenland, I think, first of all, it's true that there was Chinese economic interests in investing in Greenland a while back. There was an interest in building airports. But it's also true that the US and Denmark actually responded quite quickly to this. The way it ended with the Chinese interest in airports was that the Danish government made an offer to the Greenlandic government to fund a much better deal than the one the Chinese were offering. This wasn't said out loud, but the explicit purpose of it was to keep the Chinese out. So when it comes to security, I would also be a bit doubtful as to the concrete threat towards Greenland's territory from Russia or China. I mean, in terms of naval power, Russia is vastly inferior to NATO. So I don't think that sort of a Russian invasion of Greenland is in the cards. However, there is a point in that situational awareness in Greenland has not been well enough. It's not been good enough. There's an urgent need to increase radar capability over Greenland. There's an urgent need to take care of submarines in Greenlandic waters. However, I think the Danish and the Greenlandic authorities have been more than willing to cooperate with the US on this. So this idea that the US would have anything to gain in terms of security by going in and invading Greenland, I think is perhaps the most puzzling thing of all, if you take a look at it from a Danish or Greenlandic point of view.
I would agree entirely. Mr. Olsen, Mr. Marlow, great speaking to you. Who knows what's going to happen, but the clock has started going down on 20 days. Is that just Trump rhetoric, or could it be something more substantial? We'll have to wait and see. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Unbelievable story. Will Greenland actually be conquered? It depends on who you ask. The Europeans are worried. Denmark is extremely worried. What's going to happen next? Perhaps only time will tell. For the moment, this short break.